Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, and I'm joined by
investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff,
business editor Greg Jefferson.
And this is Monday, the second Monday of February. We're a week away from early voting. We're 5 days after President Trump was acquitted on impeachment charges, and this is a day after Parasite won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. I don't know if there's any connection there. I'm not trying to. I don't know where I'm going with this, but just to kind of give you some.
We know where you're going with this.
Just kind of placing this podcast in a pop culture context, give people a sense of where we're going. I think you all know that there was a disaster with the Iowa Democratic caucuses last week because of some problems with an app, and we got New Hampshire primary coming up this week, and so the Texas primary March 3rd, I think, is going to be huge, and we're going to have the Michael Bloomberg factor entering into that. So there's going to be a lot to look at. And everybody doing okay? You all doing okay?
Doing good.
I'm doing great.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Good.
Great.
Just want to check. I never ask, so
you never do.
I know.
You know, yeah. Like you're very unconcerned.
I'm surprised you
about the
care,
well-being
honestly.
I know. I
Yeah.
figured after we've been doing this like about a year and a half, and I figured at this point maybe I should just make sure.
Or at this point, it's like it's been so long. Who cares?
I feel loved.
Yeah, that was my hope. So I just mentioned the Texas primary coming up, and our guest today is going to be a key player in that primary. As many of you know, Senate District 19 it's a huge Senate district, extends from the San Antonio area to West Texas. It's been a Democratic seat, but it was won by a Republican, Pete Flores, in a special election in 2018. And so there's a lot of interest in the Democratic primary because there's a very good chance this seat could flip back to the Democratic side. And so a lot of the action is happening on the Democratic side. And our guest today is Xochil Peña Rodriguez, who is an attorney. Was an assistant city attorney for San Antonio. And this is your first political campaign. Is that right?
Yes, I've never been a politician yet. This is the first time I actually put myself out there as a candidate and run.
Thank you so much for but as many people will know, you're part of a big political family in San Antonio. Your father, Sir Rodriguez, was a congressman, represented, at least for part of the time, District 23, which I think kind of matches up somewhat with the Senate district you're looking at, right?
Yes, my dad has at one point or another represented every county within Senate District 19.
Just because that district is the district you're running in is so sprawling, and I would imagine so challenging. Was there any advice he gave you for? Was he like, watch out for Medina County or anything? I mean, it was just anything, just to any things.
Honestly, it was really just to remember that everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants a voice. You can't neglect communities just because it's a long drive away. They deserve representation too. They deserve to see the people who are trying to run to be elected to represent them. So, I don't intend to just stay in San Antonio. We've been going out to Alpine, Fort Stockton, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, all the communities, because that's, if you're going to run for office, you got to actually listen to people, because how else could you represent them?
So what got you interested in the race?
I, like many people in the Senate district, were incredibly frustrated with how the special election went. It's been a Democratic seat for a very long time, and it was such a negative campaign and election, and so people didn't come out. Democrats didn't vote, and we saw what happened with that. Our community was not being heard. I do not believe that the incumbent is really serving the people of this district. And at some point, you get frustrated enough that you got to step up and be the change that you want to see in the world. Why
do you think that special elections are always they're a law unto themselves, and you said turnout sometimes isn't what it should be, but was there anything else that you think happened? Because that election, I mean, I think it kind of took political watchers across the state were kind of stunned by what happened.
The two Democrats that were running, Gutierrez and Gallego, Gutierrez couldn't bring it to himself to actually endorse Gallego, so our party didn't quite coalesce and make and do the work that needed to happen to actually get the vote out and get people to vote.
Right.
Do you think that was the main problem that Gutierrez didn't endorse?
I think that was
Gallego?
part. I think that was part of it, but I think also it was an incredibly negative campaign.
Right.
Negative campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there was a
turn
lot more
off people.
going on than that.
Yes,
So, yeah.
multiple factors. There's always multiple
Right,
factors.
sure. Well, when you say you felt like Democrats weren't being heard, I mean, is that just because the volume of the primary was just so crazy high that they weren't really being paid attention to, or is there something else at play?
I think a lot of it was that it was so focused on the negative things that were happening with, the owing over $60,000 in taxes, the bankruptcies, the career politicians, and so it sounded like a lot of the same over and over. And people are tired of that.
One of the key things you've been talking about is education, and of course, in 2019, we saw the state pass HB3, which was really a big breakthrough, I think, in education. Provided more funding for teachers, for pre-K. Certainly a step in the right direction. I think the question going forward is where the long-term funding is going to be. It's a commitment to increase funding, but I think there's still questions about where the money is going to come from going forward. I mean, what are your thoughts about the bill and how you'd like to see education funded, and where you think there's still some deficiencies going forward?
Yeah, no, I think HB3 was definitely a step in the right direction. There had been cuts for so long that had been like the mantra, like we will always be cutting. So it was good to see that change a little bit. And I think that happened because Democrats won a lot more seats. And so the conversation that was being had at the legislature was very different than from previous sessions. Like I said, we need to maintain that. We need to make sure that it is a priority, because I don't think that education has always been treated as a priority, especially when you look at some of the poverty ridden areas that don't have the level of property tax that, say, in Alamo Heights would, or when you look at some of the rural districts and in terms of like their just access to internet, access to resources, and being able to maintain some better system of education it's hard.
You've talked about vocational and adult education as being really important. Do you think that's something that the state has sort of undervalued over the years?
I do think it is something that's been neglected, and there is a huge need for electricians, for plumbers. We got a lot of industries that are being disrupted, a lot of people that may be laid off and that may need to, find another job, find another career. And so I think Texas would benefit tremendously by making these opportunities more accessible to people, whether that's higher ed or vocational or whatever route that people want to go into.
Your opponent is State Rep in the primary, State Rep Roland Gutierrez, and our newspaper's editorial board raised some concerns about his support for the payday lending industry. Do you share those concerns? Is that something that really rises up to the level of alarm for you?
Yes. I think payday loan lenders have frequently taken advantage of low-income communities, of military heavy communities, and I would absolutely not have supported the bill that he proposed. I don't know why he was advocating for that. I don't think it served the people of this district.
We were trying to get to the bottom of why too, and I don't think we have.
Right, and yeah, I think that's right. And the bill in question was basically allowed for what I think they call sales leaseback, where someone can sell some item that they have, but then they would lease it back at some really high cost, and it has, I think by nature, a predatory quality to it, and so this is something that you think was a really bad idea.
Yes, it is a terrible idea, and not anything that I would support or advocate for.
One of the things that
nor have I taken any money from anyone.
Yeah, well, that's a good. I'm glad you pointed that out. One of the big issues in the state, and it's been such a divisive issue, and I think it kind of bubbled again to the surface over the summer when we had that tragedy in El Paso, was the issue of gun control and what the state can do. And it looked like you had a moment there when Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick seemed open to the idea of at least considering some gun control legislation. And Governor Greg Abbott, I think, has been pretty stubbornly opposed to that. What if you look at gun control, what forms of control would you prefer? What would you advocate?
I think at its most basic, we need universal background checks. So no matter what the point of sale is, whether it's at a gun show, you're transferring. It just makes sense. And if there is someone in the community who is making threats, who is committing, violence upon their spouse, partner, or a child, we have to have a mechanism to keep them, to keep them from accessing a deadly weapon. If you've committed domestic violence and maybe it wasn't someone you were married to, I mean, there shouldn't be a loophole for that.
Right. One of the things that your opponent Roland Gutierrez has I think this has probably been the biggest issue in his that he's talked about during this campaign has been the legalization of marijuana. He's talked about the revenue that he thinks it could generate and just the positive impact it could have as a criminal justice issue. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that and whether you agree with him about how much of a revenue enhancement it could be.
So I am not at all against decriminalizing marijuana. There are a lot of states that have already moved in that direction. I see no reason why Texas cannot also move in that direction. I think it could help a lot of people in terms of just having access, for PTSD, for anxiety, for any number of other things. And the sooner the federal government does that, the sooner they could actually do studies to see where it is really beneficial and making sure that we have a good idea of what side effects and things like that are as well. It does have the potential to bring in revenue. I don't think it's a bad idea. Whether it would bring in that much remains really to be seen. It is a projection.
Do you think as more states do this, the revenue impact will be less?
Yes. Colorado had a huge impact because they were a pioneer in this. People literally moved there for it. Once more states move in that direction, there's less need for that sort of thing, and it'll eventually taper off.
I wanted to just kind of ask a little bit about your background. Obviously, as we mentioned earlier, you were born in a political family. You majored in architecture at Rice, and
yes.
It seems to me like you didn't have an interest in the law or a political career yourself early on. So, what did you see of politics as a child? I mean, it's a very unusual thing when you have a parent as a member of Congress, and did your father bring you to campaign rallies and things like that?
I was routinely always at campaign rallies. Part of the campaign, I learned to count by counting the little voter cards, and so it's. I've been in parades. I've been dragged to meetings. I was the only child that you bring your child along. So I have gotten to see a lot of the different types of interactions and a lot of the behind the scenes of how you do a campaign. But really, my parents started off, my mom was in United Farm Workers. She was initially a migrant worker. My dad did, voter registration and was involved in Raza Unida. So they got into politics as a way of serving the community, as a way of, trying to fix problems that they saw out there. And so that was always kind of the focus in the conversations that we would have.
Roland's had some complaints about your father campaigning on your behalf. Is there any legitimacy to his concerns about that?
So we have put my father in charge of taking care of my daughter, Isela.
Is that an in-kind contribution? Or is that, I don't know how that. And just to make sure,
daycare is expensive.
To make sure people know too, he's currently a justice of the peace. So that's why
he's currently a justice of the peace, and. I think it is hard for my dad. He loves me. He's always been very supportive. He has a lot of family and friends throughout the district. It's hard not to talk about your only child. But we have worked through, I think, many of those.
Keep your yap shut.
Yeah.
He's too supportive.
Well, and it's hard, I think, for a dad to, not talk about his only child. Right. And actually, even as a judge, he's allowed to talk to his friends and family.
So Cyril Rodriguez had, I don't know that he ever had an easy race, but he had some really tough races, against Henry Bonilla, Kiko Canseco, and others. Did he ever try to, at any point, to talk you out of running?
They did in terms of are you sure that this is something that you want to do? It requires this. Well, if you're going to do that, then you have to go out and talk with all of these people, go and call, all of these people, see if you still really want to do this, and if it makes sense. So it was really more of a, well, are you sure? Do you know really fully what that means,
right.
and the level of work that will take to.
It's not really
to do.
Don't do it. Just make sure you know what you're doing, basically. Okay.
One of the things that's been interesting to me, you're a first-time candidate, but you've gotten a lot of high-profile endorsements. I think you had the Tejano Democrats, the AFL-CIO, Stonewall Democrats, and you're running against someone who has a lot of experience and has served in the legislature for a while. So I'm basically asking you to say something positive about yourself.
I've been campaigning full-time.
Right, but why do you think that is, though, that you're getting that all these endorsements have been coming your way?
I've actually made the effort of going out and meeting with all of them. It really does make a difference when people know that you're there to listen to them and to help solve their problems. And so, I may benefit from, I guess, other people's legislative history and their temperament and their reputation. But I have been working very hard to go out and meet with every single union group. Right. We've called all precinct chairs. We're hustling.
I've got to ask you, when you mentioned temperament and reputation, can you elaborate on that at all, or other candidates? I got to ask. I got to Gilbert.
I think my opponent's reputation speaks for himself.
Okay. One of the things you've talked about too is access to health care. And there are a lot of people, particularly on the Democratic side, would say that very quickly Governor Abbott could expand Medicaid, and that would deal with a lot of the issues that we have in the state. But within
would have prevented some clinic closures as well.
Right, I think that's undeniable. When you look at what the legislature can do going forward to try to expand access to healthcare, what would you like to see happen?
I would have loved to have seen expansion on Medicaid. I think that would have made so much more sense to make sure that there was access. But I think we also need to be changing a lot of the rules and regs on how we do that. So we have a huge maternal death rate. That's partially because we kick women off 60 days after they give birth. Now, that does not make any sense to me. I think if we had more women legislators, the regulations would never have been written that way. And so I think that's one of the common sense changes that we could make for children coverage. We ask them to reauthorize multiple times within a year to make sure that they stay on the program. And if they don't do it, they get kicked off. So children end up missing their vaccinations appointments. They end up missing important doctor's appointments. And that doesn't result in healthy outcomes. So I think there are a lot of changes like that we can be making, as well as loan forgiveness programs for nurse practitioners, for doctor physician assistants who go out to areas that are struggling to have providers. I have many counties within Senate District 19 that do not have a general practitioner, that do not have an OBGYN. There is no place if you want to deliver a child. So you are having to travel hours and hours and miles away to just access basic care. And so we need to figure out solutions so that we have a healthier Texas.
Right. One of the things that we're looking at going forward, we're in the early stages of looking at redistricting, and we're going through that process again. And there's been a lot of debate over the years about how Texas goes about it. It's basically been like the legislature has kind of been in control. It's basically been a partisan process. And I don't think there is a perfect way of doing this. I'm sure there isn't. But when you look at what you think the best way to do, because every decade it becomes a court fight.
Oh, and Texas never draws its own lines. It's always the courts that end up drawing the lines.
Is there a better would a so-called nonpartisan commission? And again, it's questionable whether such a thing exists.
It's hard to take politics out of redistricting, but I do think we need to find some solution so that you don't have politicians picking their voters. It's supposed to be the voters that pick the politician. From personal family experience, I know my dad had multiple districts throughout his career. He represented a whole...
I went to a lot of court hearings where I would see him in the audience watching, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there was one corner where he did a press conference, and it was like at least 4 congressional districts came into that one neighborhood, and partially it was to get him out of Congress. So that's why the South Side was cut into so many different districts.
Well, I think that was the last round of redistricting, wasn't it? When they added the new district, and that was. That was an incredible
Yeah,
message.
no, and ultimately that disenfranchises voters because then they feel that they can't make a choice, that their vote doesn't matter because the person doesn't change and they don't have any way of affecting that. And so we need to find some way of keeping together communities so that they, are all in one district.
Well, but this district, I mean, the Senate district you're running in is huge. I mean, it's
Yes.
one of the largest in the country, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And I
About
mean,
the size of a small state.
yeah, and I mean, you've got such divergent interests. I mean, you've got a huge rural component, some urban, and you're losing population in West Texas and the rural parts. In their interests, like what they want out of the legislature, is going to be different from what a San Antonian will want. How do you balance those two things? And is the district just too big?
Well, I think some of that is unavoidable simply because we're Texas and we're big. And there's a lot of it.
But that's really big.
Yes,
even,
no, it
even by
is.
Texas standards,
It is, no, for sure. But ultimately, even when I've been going out into these rural areas, a lot of people want, good schools for their kids to go to. They want access to higher ed, vocational. They want to be able to drive on the road and not, have a horrible potholes and things like that. So, be able to drink the water, be able to breathe the air.
So this district encompasses in part Medina and Uvalde counties, right?
Correct.
I'm curious do you have an opinion on what's going on here locally with the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program? Because that really extends through that area, and there is some question right now as to whether to continue that program.
There are a lot of water concerns, not just with the Edwards Aquifer. Del Rio has similar concerns. There are a number of different aquifers and how we are managing those. So we always need to be very careful and cautious with how we handle our natural resources. I do think that there needs to be protection for the recharge to make sure that one community is not sucking another community dry. And being sensible, because hey, we all have to live on this earth together, and aquifers don't necessarily have the same borders as counties.
Do you feel strongly about whether it's a program run by the city or by the San Antonio water system, or how it's administered?
There's some question about the level of funding too, because there's a tug of war going on right now for some funds between transit and aquifer protection.
It's one of the difficulties of always having competing needs for limited resources, in this case funding, because obviously we have needs for transportation as well. From what I had seen, I thought that the city was doing a good job of aquifer protection. I'll have to look more into to see what SAWS has on that as well, because ultimately we all got to get along and we have to figure out, and we should all have the main goal of protecting our water sources so that everyone can thrive and continue and grow.
When you were at the editorial board a couple of weeks ago, you talked a lot about, you talked some about the issues in West Texas and internet access, Wi-Fi access, and I imagine you're seeing this on the campaign trail. How big are the issues in that part of the state, and what can the legislature do about that?
It's a huge problem. And it's honestly, it's not just West Texas. Even the neighborhood where I live in, we have one internet provider. I had to pay about $200 or $300 to get that connection set up. And that's not something that most people can afford to do. I know a lot of times they try to say, oh, well, we can use telemedicine as a way of providing healthcare. If you don't have access to internet, you're not going to get telemedicine. So I think we need to find regional partners, whether that's some of the universities, some of the community colleges, some of the cities, to try and help provide greater internet services, Wi-Fi, so that there is, we actually just went down to Eagle Pass and had a hard time finding a place that had Wi-Fi to be able to do training for our block walkers. So it's if you don't have access to the internet, you're not competing at the same. You're not going to be able to compete at the same level.
Well, along those lines, I mean, this is outside your campaign, but what did you make of the whole situation with the Iowa Democratic Caucus and how technology failed
Yeah, technology sometimes creates more problems for us than it does. But it wasn't just the app. It was also, a bunch of Trump activists on 4chan who decided to tie up the phone lines. So, we are going to have these problems. There are going to be people who are going to try to, throw a monkey wrench into things. And create these issues. So we have to, I think, be very mindful. We have to be very conscientious about how we're running our elections, how we put these systems together.
Are you worried about voter
guards.
suppression in this election or elections?
I'm always concerned about voter suppression. If you look at the laws that Texas has been passing, we should all be concerned with voter suppression. There is no reason we shouldn't have online voter registration, same-day voter registration. We should make it very easy for citizens to be involved in the democratic process.
Well, you're, I guess, what about a week away from early voting?
Yes.
And I mean, I wanted to ask you, this reminds me because I was going to ask you if you anticipated a runoff because there are 3 candidates in the race. Is that right?
Correct.
But that reminded me of the fact that there was another candidate, Belinda, I'm going to get her name wrong, Belinda Schvetz, who, you decided to take action. This was someone, there were some real questions about whether this person lived in the district, and we see that happen from time to time. Not every campaign decides they're going to take action. You decided to take this to take court action to have her removed from the ballot. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided that it was important to you that she not be on the ballot?
Well, I think it's important that anyone who runs for a seat lives and follows the restrictions on those candidates, and we all need to follow the same rules.
Didn't she have two addresses or something like that?
Correct. And ultimately, we were successful. She is no longer on the ballot, and is not a candidate in this race. I mean, we all got to follow the same rules and make sure that all of the other candidates are following the rules, and that's what we did.
And given that you have 3 on the ballot now in the primary, do you anticipate a runoff? What are your expectations?
That is always a possibility, but we are working hard. We are block walking every day. We are phone calling. We've done our vote by mail, and we're trying to make sure that we engage with every voter that we can to get the word out, and to maybe we'll avoid a vote.
Well, we will know pretty soon. And Xochil Peña Rodriguez, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you.
We'll be back with you all next week, and take care.